Hello, this is Megan Dowdy. So this is the second week lecture, Ethics in Public Administration, an Introduction, or this is why everyone hates moral philosophy professors. So I think you'll be able to hear a lot of shuffling of my papers. I'm sorry, I needed notes to lecture. Also, this is my first time doing this, so bear with me. I'm gonna try and speak slowly. I have a tendency to speak quickly, so I'll try and speak slowly. I'm sorry if I'm going too fast. You can put this on half speed, I believe. All right, so ethics and public administration. Let us begin. So today we'll be covering Western moral philosophy to start off with. We're starting with Western moral philosophy because this is where a lot of public administration ethics gets its basis. Obviously, there's a huge field of Eastern moral philosophy, but since we are going to be focusing on United States public administration, we're going to be focusing on Western moral philosophy because that's where the United States gets a lot of its roots. And then we're going to go over a very, very, very brief history of ethics in public administration, just kind of a super cliff note version of how we got to the four big ideas in ethics in the United States today for public administration. And these are accountability theories, codes of ethics, ethics as a design science, and the ethics of dissent. And then we're kind of going to go over what's the point? Why do we care about ethics? All right, starting off. So, what is ethics? There are kind of three definitions of ethics, and the list goes from narrow to broad. Normally, I would have you guys give me some answers about what is ethics, but obviously this is a recording, so we're going to skip that step. So number one, moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So individual ethics. Then we have the discipline dealing with what is good and bad and with moral duty and obligation. It's kind of broadening it out. And then a system of moral principles and a branch of philosophy which defines what is good for individuals and society. So basic gist is that ethics is the ideas of moral good and bad and how to figure out which is which. I'll be using ethics and morality a little bit interchangeably in this lecture, and that would horrify a lot of moral philosophy professors. But for the purposes of our lecture, I don't feel the need to distinguish between the two. So don't at me. All right. So the branches of moral philosophy are ethical egoism, consequentialism, and we're going to be focusing on a specific type of consequentialism, utilitarianism, deontology, rights-based ethics, communitarian ethics, and virtue ethics. So now these are artificial constructs, dividing them into different branches, but it's useful to help us understand the basic concepts and connections between the different ideas. Also, all of these are based on what's called a first principle. A first principle is this idea that cannot be proven or disproven, from which all other principles and ideas are deduced. So in an argument, often you get down to a base principle, this first principle, that you just can't argue with because you can't prove or disprove it. So that's a first principle. So the first one we're going to talk about is ethical egoism, or me. So ethical egoism, the idea is all that is necessary and sufficient for an action to be morally right is that it maximizes one's self-interest. This doesn't mean that ethical egoists don't help other people. Ethical egoists often need the cooperation of others to obtain goods, and goods in the philosophical talk aren't necessarily material goods, but can be friendship, knowledge, safety, love. Therefore, for an ethical egoist, they may do the best thing for themselves by acting as if others have importance, provided others do the same. This is seen by ethical egoists as a short-term loss that is compensated by a long-term gain in their favor. And this argument depends on the ability of others to cooperate with the ethical egoist or attack the ethical egoist in some form if they fail to cooperate. I.e., there have to be consequences in order for ethical egoism to want to help or cooperate with other people. The most important duties for the ethical egoists are the ones that bring the biggest personal payoff to themselves. So if they were choosing whether to donate money to a local gym refurbishment or donating to hurricane relief, they're going to donate to the local gym refurbishment because that gives them the biggest personal payoff. They can then use that gym. There's also no argument for self-sacrifice in ethical egoism because you are the center of your world, and if you don't exist, then there is no ethics. Ayn Rand was the big philosopher example of this. If you want to read more about it, I suggest you check out Atlas Shrugged. All right, so then we have utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism. Yeah, no, lots of isms. So in consequentialism, whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences as opposed to the circumstances or the intrinsic nature of the act or anything that happens before the act. So whether an act is morally right depends only on the consequences of the act. In utilitarianism, which is a specific form of consequentialism, the morally right action is the action whose consequences produce the most good. So the right action is understood entirely in terms of the good the consequence produces. This is different from ethical egoism because the scope of the relevant consequences, considering the good of others as well as your own. So the idea is that an act that maximizes the good, if and only if the total amount of good for all minus the total amount of bad for all is greater than this net amount for any incompatible act available to you on that occasion. So you take all the good that you produce minus all the bad, and if it's still good, then it's the greatest good for the greatest number. If a law or action doesn't do any good, then it isn't any good. Now that seems fairly simple. You're like, okay, great, awesome. Greatest good, greatest number. And this is something that you often see in public administration. You want to achieve the greatest good for the greatest number. But the devil is in the details. What is good? So two of the biggest philosophers of utilitarianism, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, disagreed on what equaled the good. So Jeremy Bentham argued that all pleasures are equal, and they both defined the good as pleasure. So all pleasures are equal with no ranking. And this is kind of a problem because for Bentham, injecting heroin is the same pleasure as hearing your new baby laugh. Wow, that was a sentence. For the first time. And this is also called hedonism, which is this idea that the value of the consequences depends only on the pleasures and pains in the consequences, opposed to other goods such as freedom, knowledge, life, so on. So for Bentham, all pleasure is equal, no ranking. For John Stuart Mill, he subscribed to qualitative hedonism. He argued that there are higher and lower pleasures according to the preference of people who have experienced both. So he argued that injecting heroin is a false pleasure, whereas hearing your new baby laugh is a superior pleasure. He also argued that the highest pleasure known to man was the study of philosophy. So you can see how this ranking of pleasures clearly depends on the person. So it's hard to figure out the greatest good for the greatest number if we can't agree on what the greatest good is. So beyond hedonism, there are also philosophers who argued that not all pleasures are valuable and shouldn't be included in the greatest good, and not only pleasures are valuable, i.e. the greatest good should include some things that maybe aren't so pleasurable. So there was the pluralistic theory of value created by George Edward Moore. And this argued that you have to add value to grand ideas like truth and knowledge in addition to pleasure. So the greatest good for the greatest number, being the greatest pleasure, would also have to include like the quest for truth and things like that, not just things that gave you pleasure. Then there's someone who called Amartya Sen, who argued welfare consequentialism, which argued that all values that concern individual welfare, like shelter, food, those sorts of concrete things that you need in order to live, should be given more weight in a calculus of what is the greatest good for the greatest number. So that gets really complicated. How do you define what is good? Then you have which consequences. Are the actual consequences of the event what we are evaluating, or are we evaluating the expected consequences? And how far out are we going in terms of the consequences of your action? You're not a mind reader. You can't know the exact consequences of your action. So that way you can only truly evaluate the morality of your action once it has already occurred. And as we know from living in the world, often your actions have unanticipated consequences. And so things that you cannot think of when you do the action will affect the greatest good for the greatest number. So how do we determine what consequences we are evaluating and how we're evaluating once we even figure out what the good is? Then we have the consequences of what, or really for whom. So am I looking at me and my friends, most people, people in my country, people in the world? So this becomes really difficult as well, because what may be the greatest good for the greatest number if I define it looking at just my country may be different if I'm looking at the entire world. So this is a large part of the climate change argument with developing countries versus developed countries. So developing countries often argue that they shouldn't be held to the same carbon standards as developed countries, because essentially developed countries messed up our world, gave us all this horrible carbon emissions, messed up the ozone layer to get to where they are. And now they're telling developing countries that they can't do the same thing because we're all going to die. And that's not fair. So developing countries say that they should be allowed to have more carbon emissions, and developed countries should have less to right this historical wrong. So you can see how that totally makes sense. However, if I was defining consequences just for people in the United States about what's good for me and what's bad, it would not make sense. The greatest good for the greatest number in that case would be for everyone in the world to have lower carbon emissions and for us to have the most. So you can see how that can be difficult. So there's a really good example of a classic philosophical thought problem called the trolley problem that demonstrates the issues that we have with utilitarianism. So I'm going to try something so that we can watch a clip from The Good Place on NBC that does a good job of illustrating this. I was unable to get subtitles to play below it. I'm hoping I can fix this later. But if not, for a transcript of the following clip, I have a link here that'll take you to a document that you, and I'll also post the transcript in Canvas so that you'll be able to follow along. All right, so now I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to share my screen, allow. Now we're going to pull up the clip, and we're going to go like this. We're going to hit play.
All right, so I'm re-recording this from a previous lecture, and clearly this didn't work. So I'm going to stop here. I've uploaded the clip separately, and then I'm going to continue my lecture. So give me just a moment. Isn't technology so much fun?